Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. We're going to talk about how to safely fast-track strategic procurement in a crisis. And we're going to cover four main areas. To enable you to fast-track your procurement legally and avoid supplier challenge, help you structure your procurement to ensure successful outcomes, outline some accelerated contracting mechanisms that can get you into a safe place fast, and finally, explore how to accelerate the competitive dialogue procurement process for highly complex strategic relationships in just 90 days. As well as that, we'll be providing an opportunity for you to ask the expert panel through an open Q&A forum. By the way, just feel free to submit questions all along. And a recording of the webinar will be available. If you'd like this quickly, then just put R into the questions box and we'll make sure that that gets expedited to you. May I now introduce you to the experts leading the session today. We have with us Stephen James, our operations manager. Steve's been with us for over 9 years and tends to deal with the procurement of larger strategic supplier relationships. We also have Richard Kerr. Now Richard specialises in procurement and contracting strategy for complex relationships. He also has extensive experience in dispute and expert witness work, and he's worked with us as part of the team for 18 years. And last, I'm Alan Watton, a co-founder of Best Practice Group. My specialism is in simplifying complex contractual arrangements for strategic supplier relationships and optimising their delivery performance. And as a practice, we specialise really in three things. Getting you into strategic supplier relationships so you get the benefits quickly. Improving the performance of those relationships, and making sure that if you're in a situation that's completely failed, then you're maximising the value from it and help you to get out and transition to another one quite quickly. Now we've got a lot of experience in this area of more than 500 relationships. So basically it's to try and make sure that your the knowledge that we cover today is based on really good practice about what works well and also what doesn't work well from our own war wounds in dealing with so many. For the people that are just coming on again, I've noticed quite a few just coming on. So it's just really to say that we're covering four areas today, really around making sure that you fast track your procurement safely, you get to a successful outcome. We've got some accelerated contracting mechanisms that we'll be covering, and we'll also be covering the details on the competitive dialogue. And please ask questions as we go through. Now, as far as Best Practice Group is concerned, fast tracking a lot of these complex procurements can sometimes not end well. We've come from the very nasty end of the business of going into courts and providing expert witness opinion on where these relationships have gone wrong and why. And it's given us a very unique perspective on the specific factors that need to be in place. So what actually happens there is, because we've dealt with so many of them, this information will make sure you're covered in the right way to accelerate it safely. Now, if we look at the general trend of projects and their successes and failures, you'll see that there's quite a lot of statistics on different areas of these. And I won't go through all of these individually, but basically the average failure rate on strategic supplier relationships is anywhere between 56 to 87%. So that's quite significant. And Standish Group's research is in fact very, very enlightening. But Richard will cover this later in the webinar. And ideally, if these relationships are put together in a fit-for-purpose way, and you end up getting the benefits from them, you should end up with 10 characteristics of what the supplier relationship should really be optimizing for you. And again, we won't go through them all, but essentially making sure your objectives are being met, very importantly, making sure that the supplier acts as a critical friend to you, so they actually challenge what you're asking, as in validating what you're asking, but actually making sure they guide you in the right way. And again, Richard will cover more about this later on. But that then leads to obviously inherent commercial trust, making sure your services are always aligned to your outcomes, you get reduced service cost and evidence-based results. So all of that mix of the 10 characteristics are what we see in the best organizations who run these relationships really well. Now, what I'll do is I'll pass you now on to Stephen, who will take you through the specifics of the procurement elements of this. Stephen?
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Now, I just want to start by showing some recent high-profile examples of fast-track procurements undertaken by the government. Now, you might be aware of all of these, and while some have been successful, others have had their fair share of issues. But one thing they all have in common is actually the lack of transparency in regards to the procurement and the award process. So I think there's going to be much more scrutiny in the months ahead. We'll start off with Zulk Engineering, a Swiss-based IT development firm. They've been awarded a 6-month contract to develop and support the COVID-19 tracing gap, and that has been worth £4 million. Hopefully, should be going live in the next few days, and we'll probably be seeing over the next few months how successful it is, and if people are right to be worried about the data and privacy. Deloitte, who were recruited by the Department of Health to create a network of 50 testing facilities around the UK, but also by the Cabinet Office to assist with the procurement of PPE for NHS staff. Now, testing and PPE have both been in the news recently. Reports of tests going to the wrong lab or getting lost, many taking much longer than they should. And obviously PPE had some issues quite early on, not having enough, but we did hear yesterday that hopefully that should now be under control. Serco, they've recruited 21,000 people and are training them in contact tracing. Now, of course, we hope this is going to be a huge success, but we have seen recent reports of inadequate training for the contact tracers. And Serco themselves have left a trail of high-profile failed contracts, such as the electronic tagging scandal and the way they've managed GP surgeries in prisons. NHS England contracted KPMG to build 7 Nightingale hospitals that could treat thousands of coronavirus patients in need of critical care. Now, thankfully, these hospitals never really needed, but this is a success story. You know, the hospitals were built extremely quickly. EY, now they've been given a contract to provide guidance for various business sectors on how to reopen after the lockdown. So a lot of the contract notices for these and many more have not actually been published, and given the nature of these contracts, we think the media is going to be picking up in the months ahead regarding the procurement process used, how much actual money was spent, but ultimately whether it was value for money. So for the first part of this webinar, I'm going to be walking through some of the options available to you in regards to fast-tracking the procurement exercise and the practicalities of doing it. So, and Richard will then show you how to actually get the best outcome from your procurement. So we're going to be discussing 4 options and in order of how quickly each option can get you to contract. Now remember that although I'm focusing on speed to contract, Richard will be showing you how to get the best outcome, and obviously there is a big difference between the two. Okay, so the first option, well, it's not to undertake a procurement exercise at all, and it's just to extend or modify your existing contract. Second one we're going to discuss is doing a direct award to a supplier due to an extreme urgency. Thirdly, to call off from an existing framework agreement. And the last one we're going to discuss is to use standard procurement procedures but with accelerated timescales. Now I realise these are heavily focused on the public sector, but looking at the list today, majority of you are public sector, but for those in the private sector, these are still relevant. You can still extend, you can still make direct award, and you can undertake a competitive procurement exercise. And the second half of the webinar is still very much relevant in how to get the best outcome. So the first option, to extend or modify an existing contract during its term. So this is obviously going to be the quickest option available to you. So let's have a look at what the regulations say for those in the public sector. Well, Regulation 72(1)(c), contracts may be modified without a new procurement procedure where all of the following conditions are fulfilled. So firstly, the need for modification has been brought about by circumstances which a diligent contracting authority could not have foreseen, and the modification does not alter the overall nature of a contract, and any increase in price does not exceed 50% of the original contract value. So if all of these apply to you, you could modify your contract with your supplier, but you do still need to publish a modification by way of an overdue notice to say that you have relied on the regulation. So if it was related to COVID-19, for example, make reference to any specific facts. You know, your staff might have been diverted or they could have been off sick. And multiple modifications are allowed as long as you keep hitting that criteria. But you should probably limit the duration or scope of any extension and think about running a procurement alongside it. Now, there are other grounds available under Regulation 72 for extending contracts, including the pretty obvious one, if the proposed variation had already been provided for in the contract, where a change of contractor cannot be made for economic or technical reasons, or where the modifications are not substantial. So to lower the legal risk for you, if more than the one ground is applicable, please include these in your written justification. Now, if you are considering extending your contract, I would also recommend undertaking a contract and performance review as it stands now. So what does the contract say in regards to extensions? What's the process for communicating this? But also, is the supplier performing as you would expect? Is the contract still aligned with what you're actually getting on the ground? Or is it slowly shifted over the years and no longer bears resemblance to what you first signed up to? If a current contract is not aligned with what you're getting or what you want to get in the future, please don't just simply extend it. Take the time now to update the whole contract, and that includes the services, the specifications, service levels, KPIs, commercials, and so on. Now, if it's a new project you want your incumbent supplier to take on, then treat it like a procurement. Document the background to the project, your requirements, business objectives and outcomes you want to achieve, and so on. And ask a supplier to respond to this just like you would in a normal proposal. And you could also use the same document to do some soft market testing with other suppliers to help benchmark your supplier's response. Okay. The second option I want to discuss is directly awarding a contract due to extreme urgency or absence of competition. So again, what do regulations say about this? Well, Regulation 32, you can use the negotiated procedure without prior publication if one of the following applies. And remember, on the previous one, it was all of the conditions had to be met. This is just one of the conditions. So maybe you received no tenders or no suitable tenders when you used one of the normal procurement procedures, or there's only one supplier in the marketplace. Now, this could be for technical reasons or exclusive rights or IP rights. But also, third option is for reasons of extreme urgency. Now, these should be brought about by events unforeseeable by you, the contracting authority, but also where time limits for the normal procedures cannot be complied with. Now, I assume that the government examples I showed you earlier exercise this right. But remember that the circumstances invoked to justify extreme urgency must not in any event be attributable to you, the contracting authority. Please keep proper records of decisions and actions and so forth, as this can mitigate against the risk of a legal challenge. And if you do make a direct award, you still should publish a contract award notice. I would carry out a separate assessment of the test before undertaking any subsequent or additional procurements to ensure that they're still met, particularly to ensure that the events are still unforeseeable. So for example, as time goes on, what might have been unforeseeable a month ago may not be now. Just delaying or failing to do something in time does not make the situation qualify as urgent, unforeseeable. This is because the regulations expect you to plan its time and to use one of the competitive procedures. And case law has held that knowing that something needs to be done means it is foreseeable. Now, I also wanted to point out the government procurement policy notices. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of these, but PPN 0120 is quite relevant because it does cover the COVID-19 outbreak, but it really just sort of covers some of the stuff we've already discussed. PPN 0220, supply release. So this is about putting payment measures in place to support supplier cash flow, such as advance payments. Now, our last webinar a month ago covered the due diligence that you would need to undertake if you want to do advance payments. So I'm not going to go through it now, but it's well worth a watch just for that. So if you want a recording, just go into the question box and say previous recording, and we'll make sure we send that to you as well. PPN 0320 is also about accelerated payments to suppliers. Now, so just because I've outlined that direct award might be an option open to you, we don't advise you do this unless the justification outweighs the risks. So in the government examples I showed you earlier, you could forgive the fact that these might have been awarded directly because it was a matter of life and death. But for most people, this will not always be the situation. For most of you, you'll have time for some sort of procurement exercise. So, you know, some of this is pretty obvious, but competitive procurement obviously follows the principles of open, fair, and being transparent to the marketplace and suppliers. And you choose your supplier against the objective criteria that you set. And all of this, hopefully, should increase your higher chance of fitness for purpose. But on the flip side, direct award, the lack of competition will mean a supplier advantage. And that advantage will cover pretty much all areas of the relationship. But obviously, if there's no competition, there's no incentive for them to keep the price down. So you will be paying over the odds, you know, £4 million for an app, for example. Direct award, you're going to have a higher risk of choosing either wrong supplier and or the wrong product. And all this is, we've got a lower chance of it actually being fit for purpose. Now, the third option I want to discuss is frameworks. So frameworks are known for being quicker than a normal procurement procedure. So the suppliers have been pre-qualified and some documentation is already there, such as the contract and maybe even pricing structures. Some frameworks give you the option to direct award, and some give you the option for mini competition. Now the rules and the process to follow is different for each framework. So you really do need to read the documentation for each specific framework that you might want to use. I've read many of these in my time and they're not always the easiest to get your head around. So please do set some time aside to understand the ins and outs of each framework. And you might want to look for things like the expiry date of the framework, the contract duration, extension options, reporting procedures, and so on. Okay, so read all the documentation. But one of the most common pitfalls we see is that clients think that all the hard work has been done with regards to frameworks. So for example, they may see template requirements and think, great, you know, that saved me a ton of time. And they may see a contract and again they think, great, I don't need to spend any money on legal advice. However, in our experience, it's never that easy. And if you provide a supplier with a standard template requirement, all you're going to get back is a templated answer. And the contract, well, in our experience, that's never fully complete anyway. So for example, the schedules are often left empty and they're still designed for you to complete. Now, obviously, for us in the UK, the Crown Commercial Service is obviously the most obvious place to start to search for a framework. These are probably one of the most popular ones. And just go to the website and type it in. Obviously, see 136 that they currently have. Again, some of the most popular ones: G-Cloud, Digital Outcomes and Specialists is designed more for technology and cloud-related procurements. Things like MSSF2 for consultancy support. Also, I'm not going to go through them all. You can quite easily go to that website and put your search criteria in there to be able to find them. Now, you can also get frameworks specific to each sector. So, for example, the NHS Shared Business Services, they have over 73 frameworks. Now, and there's obviously many more out there. And if anybody wants any advice on whether, if there's a framework out there that's actually relevant to you, or you want any support in knowing what you need to complete as part of that, then please let me know in the question box now. And again, I'll be quite happy to help you out on that. So the last option here is to use the standard procurement procedures, but if you do want to, you can accelerate the timescales. Now, just on accelerated timescales, please do think twice before reducing timescales for suppliers to respond, because although you may think it's good for you, it could actually be detrimental because suppliers will not respond if the timings don't work for them. It takes a lot of time to write a good bid, so you need to give them sufficient time to do so. So in our experience, 2 weeks is the absolute minimum, but 3 or even 4 weeks will result in more suppliers and better quality bids. Okay, so the open procedure, I'm not going to go into detail on this. I'm sure everybody here has used the open procedure at some point. But because we deal with more of a complex and strategic type procurement, the open procedure is not really that relevant to us. But if you want to, you can reduce the time limit for submissions to 15 days. And it's also worth pointing out that there's actually no express requirement for a situation to be unforeseeable here. So as long as you have a justification, you can reduce these timescales. Okay, restricted procedure, again, pretty common one. This has got 2 stages, and you can reduce the submissions for your first selection stage to 15 days, and you can reduce the time limit for submissions for the 10 days. Again, I will think twice about using 10 days as well. Now, it's that competitive procedure in negotiation. Now we'll get into procedures which are used for the more complex procurements, because you actually being able to get down and sit down in front of your suppliers and discuss what you want. Now, competitive procedure in negotiation is very similar to the restricted process. It's got 2 main stages, but in the middle, if you want to, you can negotiate on certain aspects. But you have to set that, be really clear up front what's negotiable and what's not. So you need to be really clear on what you want up front. Now, competitive dialogue, well, actually, there's no prescribed accelerated timescales. There's only accelerated timescales for the top 3. So the only prescribed time you actually have is for 30 days for your selection stage. But after that, you can design competitive dialogue however you want to best suit your needs. And we are aware that CD has a bad reputation for taking too long. But in our experience, it's always down to either poor planning or with little or no procurement strategy. And I've heard people say that they would rather use the restricted procedure just because it's quicker than the competitive dialogue. So what I'm going to do is show you how you can accelerate the competitive dialogue process to only take 3 weeks longer than the restricted process, but with all the extra benefits of dialoguing with a supplier. So just before I go into this, I do need to make it clear that this is not a one-size-fits-all. So the more complex your solution, or the more gaps in either your requirements or your commercials or your legal areas, then the more time you might need. But this is for those that think I'd actually either you don't have that many gaps and you think you want quite an accelerated dialogue, or for those that would rather use a restricted process, then this is going to be a much better process to use. So, day 1, just like all the others, you'd have prepared the contract notice, your SSQ document, the response templates, and also the descriptive document that outlines who you are, what you're trying to achieve, in as much detail as possible in regards to requirements, objectives, and outcomes, and so forth. So once you've issued that, you'd only give 4 weeks, or 30 days to be more precise, to get your SSQ responses. And then you'll give a week to review, evaluate, and select how many suppliers you want to dialogue with. And we would say 3 suppliers is always a good number. Any more, and it does take longer, obviously. But if you only choose 2 suppliers, there's a risk of one dropping out, and that just removes the competition. Now, to start the dialogue, you would issue your ITPD, that's your invitation to participate in dialogue. This is effectively your ITT and includes everything you would normally put in there, including your contract. Now, once you've issued your ITPD at the end of week 5, you are allowed to jump straight into dialogue. Now, remember, you've explained this during the SSQ phase, so the suppliers are already well prepared, and they know they're going to jump straight into dialogue with you. So there's no one-size-fits-all for this next phase, so it really does depend on your circumstances. But in this scenario, I've allowed 3 weeks of dialogue, so for week 6, 7, and 8. Now, so for example, you could discuss your requirements during the first week, and then during the second week, the supplier comes back to discuss their solution. This will also give you a chance to validate what it is they're saying. Week 3 is less for any further feedback, but also for discussing things like commercials and legals. And then at the end of week 8, you would close the dialogue by issuing your ITSFT. That's your invitation to submit final tenders, which really would just be your updated version of your ITPD. Now, so you would give 2 weeks for your suppliers to respond. Now, it may only look like 2 weeks, but remember, actually, this is week 10 now, so they've had this information for 10 weeks. Once you've got your response, you've got a week to review, evaluate, and award your contract, which will allow you to, going into week 12, to start your 10-day standstill period and prepare for contract signature. Okay, so there's your accelerated competitive dialogue process. But just remember, when you go fast, there's obviously a higher risk of mistakes. So you'll have to weigh this up with your need of urgency. So that's my part of the webinar finished. I'm going to hand you over to Richard now, and he's going to go through the second part of the webinar.
Thank you, Steve. So now we turn to the second half of the webinar, which is how to ensure successful outcomes from your procurement. By success, we mean not just getting to the end of the procurement on time and on budget, but that the procurement also results in successful outcomes for your organisation. There are three items that I'd like to cover today. The first is trends and success rates globally and in the UK. The second is lessons learned and insights into causal factors of success and failure. And finally, to suggest implementable steps, even in the fast-track procurement. So let's turn now to global success rates. This year, the Standish Group published their 2020 report. A very helpful report because it goes back through the last 25 years of projects and business relationships that it's evaluated. This graph on the screen now is their highest level findings of success across all sectors, regardless of project or contract size. As you can see from this graph, the success rates in green have been fairly consistent over the last 25 years at roughly 1 in every 3 projects. You'll see from the red and yellow lines that 2 in every 3 are either challenged close to 50%, or fail in the red close to 20%. Failure, by the way, is classed as projects or contracts either getting cancelled or the product never getting implemented. So those are the results across all industries and all project sizes. There's 2 other points to make about the results. Firstly, their research shows that public sector projects are enjoying a lower success rate than the average, being about 22% successful overall across all types and sizes, so about 2 in every 10 being successful. And also, in big multi-million pound projects and contracts, success rates drop to only 6% across all sectors. And they based their findings on a very detailed analysis of 50,000 projects. So, how to measure success? And why are so few successful? Well, first, let's look at the success factors. And we'll look at 4 measures of success. Good project management, customer satisfaction, return on value, and alignment to strategic goals. Using these measures of success, the results are as follows. Firstly, the traditional method. This is on time, on budget, and on task. This is a classic project management measurement. By this measure, 37% were successful. However, what became clear is that just because a task was completed on time and to budget, it didn't necessarily mean that it was the right task, nor that it would deliver customer satisfaction, nor overall value. So, a secondary lens was put on the data, which is called the modern method. And this pays more attention to customer satisfaction, measuring on time, on budget, resulting in a customer that is at least somewhat satisfied. A somewhat satisfied customer doesn't seem a very high bar, but nevertheless, 31% of projects achieve this. What that modern measure doesn't show is value to the organisation. And so the pure method was devised. And this measures high customer satisfaction and high return on value to the organisation. And by that measure, 16% of projects were successful. And then the final lens through which to look at success is what they call the bullseye measurement, which is on target and close to the strategic organisational goals. And that yielded 29% success rate. So what this shows is a consistent picture. It is difficult, but not impossible, to get success. But equally, it's very important to consider at the outset what success actually looks like for your organisation. If you want to achieve high customer satisfaction and high return on value, for instance, then it's going to be essential for you to have agility and flexibility in order that focus can be applied and reapplied to high value activities in what is currently a rapidly evolving global landscape. So that finishes the first item on the agenda, which is global data on success. And now, turning to item 2, we'll look at some lessons learned and causal factors for success and failure. Here's Albert Einstein. Some say he defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. What our data and other global data is showing is that the same approaches are being used again and again, but yielding the same unsatisfactory results. Certainly, in the many reviews we undertake, we often see the same things being done both before and after contract, all of which rarely yield successful outcomes. Today, as we're looking at procurement, let's put the spotlight on one common item, a procurement process and approach, to see what we can learn. So, this is a common procurement approach. It probably needs no introduction whatsoever. It generally works well for simple and commodity-based procurements, but not so well for more complex procurements. And as we're going through this, please do feel free to leave a comment in the chat box if it's one with which you're familiar. So, in this common procurement approach, the buyer sets about creating a very detailed requirement specification. They put that into an ITT or an RFP document, put it out to the market. The market take a look at all the requirements, interpret the requirements, and explain which ones they will be able to deliver and which ones they won't. The responses come back in. The buyer reviews the provider's responses. It's followed by some form of beauty parade. Then the best supplier is told that it's preferred. And at that point, the supplier often says, look, about this contract, there's just one or two small items that we'd like to take a look at. That can result in a unsatisfactory negotiation. Nevertheless, everyone needs to get on with it at this point, so things get signed off. And then the procurement being ended, often the buying team and the supplier sales team disappear from the landscape, and 2 new teams arrive to start the delivery and implementation. That's a very common approach, and it's a very risky approach for complex matters. It works well enough for commodities, but for more complex or people-based procurements, it's actually building risk at every stage to the buyer. First of all, in relation to the requirements, the buyer is stipulating all of their requirements, and in that respect, they're being the expert. The requirements may be wrong, or it may be that a requirement is specified by the buyer, but the vendor knows that the outcome could be achieved in a much better way, but it hasn't got the opportunity to discuss that. Also, there's a concept of requirements waste. Standish research on this suggests that 64% of requirements never or rarely get used. And if we think about our own usage of, say, Microsoft Word, most of us, I'm sure, only use probably 10% of the functionality within that program. Within this standard procedure, there's no opportunity for the vendor and the buyer to have a conversation to really get to grips with what the requirement means, or what the buyer does, or wants, or needs. And because the vendor is being marked on how many yeses it puts into the ITT, then it's just inclined to say yes to the requirement, and obviously even if they don't actually agree that the requirement is valid. And so all in all, it leads to an increase in guesses and assumptions, indicative implementation plans, caveats around costs, and generally misunderstandings and misaligned expectations. It also leads, by people leaving from the procurement who were familiar with the discussions, a level of corporate amnesia as to what's been agreed and why when the new teams arrive. So, needless to say, the results are low using this procedure for complex or strategic procurements. When it comes to requirements, you're paying for a whole bunch of requirements that you might never need. Equally, a double whammy, because if you miss a requirement, then you pay for it because it's not part of the contract. The contracts aren't fit for purpose because there are too many agreements to agree for, and agreements to agree are not generally contractually enforceable. The vendor, by saying yes to all of the requirements which have been asked for, if they are wrong, is still obligated to deliver them. And so this all leads to a landscape where the solutions and the services are not fit for purpose, the deadlines are missed, there's cost and time overruns. There's necessarily some change requests coming in, many of which may be felt contentious, which then leads to dissatisfaction and arguing on both sides. So it really is a classic lose-lose situation for people, and just a very poor platform from which to try to build a strong relationship. Now, on that previous slide, one of the comments was that the buyer was the expert, and that built a risk. And that's worth unpacking a little, as it's quite a key concept, which can be very helpful to getting much improved results. It boils down to the extent to which your organization will need to be reliant upon the provider's advice. If we assume three types of relationship, firstly, a vendor-buyer, secondly, a specialist provider, and finally, a strategic partner, what we'll do is we'll evaluate what the position is in respect of relying upon their expertise and their advice, and how that then correlates into fitness for purpose of whatever the solution or service may be. So firstly, a vendor-buyer scenario. In this scenario, there's very little reliance upon the vendor's advice. The buyer understands exactly what it is that they want to procure. They understand how to stipulate that requirement. They're also probably able to stipulate timescales and potentially even costs. In that particular instance, the buyer is the expert. It knows what it wants and needs, and the provider must deliver to your spec and your plan. The risk, of course, being that if your spec is wrong, that's your problem. Then moving up a scale into the realm of specialist provider. Now, this is, in this relationship, there's much more reliance upon the provider's advice. There's mutual expertise, but the main thrust to going to the market is to get the expert insights, skills, and usually technologies you need to get the outcomes you require. In this type of relationship, your organization also brings skills, and hence there is a collaborative approach. In this type of relationship, the buyer is advised to say, look, here is our problem, and the market is asked to put their thinking caps on and work with the buyer as to how that problem can best be solved. Very common type of relationship for some of the bigger systems or other collaborative relationships where teams really do need to engage and work well one with another. And the final type is the role of a strategic partner. In this type, the buyer is really 100% reliant upon the advice and skills of the strategic partner. For instance, in an austerity scenario, a county council might be asked to cut its costs by 30%, and it won't know how to cut the cost of services by 30%, so it might throw it out to the market on an outcome-based contract and say, listen, whoever can do this for us, you know, we're all ears. And as you can see, all of the eggs are in one basket. There's complete reliance upon the strategic partner having the smarts to do that. So it's an important point, not just for making sure you've gone to the market for the right time of provider and setting up the scene for a very effective and collaborative relationship, but also because there's quite a lot of commercial risk mitigation potentially available. in instances where the provider is an expert and has been asked to apply their skills as an expert, there's been a few court rulings which have explained a little bit what's expected of them. So some of these can be articulated as they need to understand and validate what it is they can deliver, validate what it is they cannot deliver, and also validate the consequential impact of what they cannot deliver. And if we think back to the common approach for procurement, very often we don't get that. We just get a series of yeses to the requirement. But what this is saying is actually, no, it needs to dig under the surface to that and really have a think about the validity of the requirement as well. The expert provider is to give advice to the client with reasonable care and skill. And reasonable here is commensurate with the amount of expertise which the provider has represented. And this feeds also into this concept of duty to warn, where really the role is to say, look, please do our thinking for us. You've done this many times before. If we'd like you to look round corners, tell us what's coming, and warn us of any issues we need to be aware of. And all of this is down really to foreseeability. And essentially, somebody can be as expert as they like, but if they're not, if they haven't been introduced to your organisation, to your needs, to your outcomes, to all those factors, then they don't really have the points of reference whereby they can play this role very effectively. If, however, you can find environments to help educate them into your organisation and requirements, then all of this comes into play. And it means that risks can be shared much more fairly if the right relationship and environment is created. And particularly importantly at this time, it fosters environments of trust and collaboration and credibility. There's a free paper, a white paper on these factors, and if you would like to receive that, please enter VR into the questions box for your copy. And so, bringing all of these concepts together, here is a step change approach which does lead to much higher successful outcomes. Down at the bottom, we see the arrow saying aligning expectations and equipping the teams for success. And the secondary arrow there is contracting the vendor for solution. And then going up on the right-hand side there, we see the all-important fitness for purpose and the vendor's responsibility in that respect. And so the first thing we'd recommend, the buyer obviously starts off as the expert of who the buyer is, of their organisation. And they may well be familiar with the vision or the strategy, the business case, any outcomes or objectives that are known to be known. And also, they'll have insights, probably, in terms of if there are any incumbent providers in the landscape which must be kept hold of, or if there's any red lines around any technologies or systems. So they will have all that context, and the buyer will be in a good position, generally, to be able to articulate that. So that sets the context. The next step is to begin to align the expectations. Now, in this instance, the buyer can set the initial scope, whereas under the old, the first procedure that we looked at, the scope was set, all the requirements were documented, that was what it was. In this instance, you're saying, look, we believe this to be the scope, but what we'd really want to do is to just validate that with the market and just find out that this is actually the most viable scope for any other constraints which you might have. And within the scope, or to help articulate the scope, there can be things like outputs and reporting and management information and operational processes and transactions and functions. That then gives a very good starting point for a good market engagement. And as Steve mentioned earlier, a very valid approach is 3 rounds of discussion. The first, to discuss requirements. Once the requirements have been discussed and validated and maybe even improved upon, it's time for the provider to discuss what solution they believe is most appropriate. And once that's been agreed, they can be discussing how that can be implemented and what sort of resourcing that will require, and also, very importantly, the delivery methodology that they're going to use, because very often it's important to enshrine a good cultural and collaborative fit around how the thing is going to get delivered and how you're going to work together. And these discussions and dialogues really, really do help cement that understanding and test that viability early on. So once you've got requirements understood, solution understood, delivery methodology understood, you're in a good place to understand how much it's going to cost. Not just year one, but the whole life cost, which is very helpful for evaluation. And also, what you're then able to do is to create a fit-for-purpose contract, which is reflective of what it is the parties are seeking to achieve. And so it's a process of mutual due diligence, whereby both parties are discussing and understanding very clearly what will be gotten, what won't, viabilities, benefits, as well as governance, alignment, and competence. And very importantly and very handily, it can also lead to a clarity of solution before the contract is signed. And so you may well arrive at a high-level design that everyone's happy with, and success and quality criteria, and strong planning and resourcing and governance. And that gives you all the tools that you need for good, effective supplier relationship management and fit-for-purpose contract. You'll see down at the bottom there, due diligence via dialogue and continuity. I mentioned earlier, very often the procurement team and the sales team disappear once the contract is signed. What we found is that that's particularly unhelpful. Much better to get subject matter experts, delivery experts, and people who are going to be involved in the actual implementation, whatever that is, transition, etc., to be chatting with each other, to be getting acquainted with everything. And then, once the contract is signed, that same team can be hitting the ground running and maintaining the cadence, as well as the integrity of what has been agreed. And thereafter, of course, you have a very fit-for-purpose contract, which is utterly reflective of the parties' discussions, responsibilities, and things they feel happy and comfortable with. It's getting the best out of the expertise out of both sides. It's helping to get trust and flexibility and cooperation from the word go, and it's helping to drive innovation. We recommend, as Steve mentioned earlier on, if you are able to dialogue with 3 parties, that will really help to test out what the market capability is, what the viability is, and it will also give you very important feedback as to what might be the most viable, high value, best approach to achieve whatever it is you're seeking to achieve. Because we are talking, of course, about an accelerated approach to hitting the market. And so, what that all means is, the reason why these bigger ones in particular are unsuccessful is because it is a complex landscape. It's crossing what are often siloed disciplines: legal, commercial, solution, technical, delivery, etc. But by the discussions, it's making a simplification of all these areas. It's also aligning different corporate cultures on a common achievable goal. And because the teams have met already, it's setting in place strong working relationships with no surprises. And that can overcome many of the people factors which will otherwise ordinarily exist. And so, as you can see from this simplistic representation on the screen, the dotted purple line being a full landscape, a full holistic picture of everything that's going on. And at the heart of it there, a role or to keep all of those factors in perfect tension in order to deliver the outcomes that you need to have delivered in the most expeditious way. And so that concludes the second agenda item, which was insights into causal factors of success and failure. And now really it's turning to fast-track pragmatism in an uncertain world, and a minimum viable product we suggest for success. So the first thing is internal alignment. Having your internal organizational expectations aligned is really very, very advisable, and it sometimes can be missed. So to understand what problems to be solved, the business objectives, what good looks like, and also to understand exit factors. If there are incumbent providers who may well be departing, what might that mean? And to factor that through to the final exit, to really make sure you've got governance in place for that. The second thing is a checklist. So we're trying to go fast, and the question really is, well, what do we have in our hand already? Is there a business case? Are there requirements and processes? Do we have a good handle on outcomes, objectives and benefits? Are these documented already? interfaces and reporting. And the next question is specificity of contract requirements and budget. And really, if you do already know what really is an excellent contract, you really are 100% sure of your requirements, and you've got a really good handle on your budget, then that gives you various sort of options and routes to market, much more so than if you really do need a lot of market input to help you understand these three factors. If you do need the market input, then that's precisely what the competitive dialogue procedure has been created for, to help you get to those answers and create good, strong bases for successful relationships. And the next section then is market engagement. So going back to the thought of what type of provider do we need, what's the relevance to us, if any, of expert responsibilities, how much reliance on advice do we need, and what does that mean, therefore, in terms of market engagement options. And once you have those three items, you're well equipped and well informed to work out exactly what your best fast-track strategy is. And you can do a heat map, maybe using that representation on the previous slide, to understand, okay, where will this get us to at the end of the procurement? And that will let you know the gaps and the risks and the strengths and the weaknesses of which options you have available to you. It will help you also understand what will need to be fit-for-purpose governance, effective sponsorship, communications, internal and external, continuity management, and risk management. And furthermore, it will help you, we recommend you understand timescales and any constraints around that, any approvals processes. And the final 2 points here are delegated authority and decision latency. These really do require a full webinar on their own. They're so important. Decision latency in particular is how long does it take to make a decision and what is the value of that decision. And so if we think about a simple project with, say, 100 decision points, if it takes a room full of 22 people to make that decision, it takes them 6 hours, and 50% of those decisions are overturned before people meet again the following week, then you can see that the project timescale is going to extend ad infinitum. Compare that to smart decision making, let's say a smaller team who can make 100 decisions on 2 hours per decision without overturning them, then you can see that that process is only going to take 200 hours. And it is proven it's much better to make quick decisions, because if they do lead to a fail, then the fail is identified very, very quickly, and that can just be changed and got on with and gone about a different way. So really, decision latency is such a key factor to consider, as well as delegated authority and how really you can get that speeded right up if you are in an accelerated scenario. And that then informs you into how you're going to approach the dialogue, what the communications will need to be, your structures, your process, what attendees you'll need in the meetings, subject matter experts, etc., what inputs you'll be taking into the meeting, and what outputs you'll be requiring once the meeting has concluded. You can consider whether you're wishing for any contracts for advice, and also you're able to understand a collaborative agreement on gaps and risks, and really with a feel, particularly now, for flexibility, cooperation. And if you can't get certainty before the contract, then a route to getting certainty after it, which is mutually acceptable. And then finally, thinking about the contract and the performance, well, what will make for a fit-for-purpose contract structure which will incentivize cooperation, collaboration, delivery, and good team working? What will make for a good partnership? And so if you do need to contract quicker, and if there are going to be gaps, then the post-contract verification process is a structured way whereby both parties say, look, we do understand there are agreements to agree and we need to do some further due diligence post-contract. There'll be a period of time and we will have various parameters around that. And if that does unhatch and unearth some really unexpected things or showstoppers, that the parties will have a mutually agreed plan B, so that they can get over that, or that they can disengage amicably, and that the buyer will be left in a position whereby they can continue without needing to waste a load of time having to start again. And then finally, that all-important point about continuity and hitting the ground running. If you're wanting to get something delivered very quickly, then get the discussions happening early and make it an obligation on both parties that the same team will maintain and continue both before the contract and then immediately after it's signed. So thank you very much for your time today. That completes my talk, and I'll hand back to Alan for any questions.
Thank you for that, Rich. Okay, and just in brief terms, in terms of if you are in the process of fast-tracking any of these things, and we'll get on to questions in just one second, there's really sort of many areas, according to the list that Rich has just put up there, for the minimal viable process to succeed in these things quite quickly. But just as an example, you know, if you wanted to either quickly assure the fast-track strategy, for example, to make sure you covered all the bases, to make sure you weren't going to come unstuck, or making sure that the contract terms within the framework or within the FACTRAS process that you'd identified are actually going to drive really good collaborative behaviours between you, and you're not going to get misunderstandings. And likewise, when you talk about misunderstandings, there's an opportunity there to maybe just very quickly assure the requirements, so that between you and the providers, you're not going to get misunderstandings over those requirements, which interestingly occurs in about 60% of most of the big strategic relationships, that misunderstandings are quite significant in the requirements, and therefore that leads to often quite large change control, chargeable change control factors and so forth. But if you want a quick assurance or you want a quick informal chat around that, just enter FP in the questions box and we'll give you an informal call there afterwards over the next couple of days. In terms of questions, there's been quite a lot of questions actually over this process. So the first one is from Michael. What key factors do we need to consider in engaging suppliers quickly, bearing in mind we've got social distancing issues in place? Steve or Rich, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'll go first, Rich. So I think we've all had practice over the last couple of months of using technology for keeping in touch. So, you know, the technology is absolutely there to continue doing these procurements, having dialogues, having meetings. It might not be face-to-face, but it'll be remotely. And that technology can also help support not just the speed, but even the cost of the actual procurement. So, you know, and supporting the negotiations potentially within that. You can have notes in front of you. You can do private chats while, you know, to your colleagues while you're in these meetings with suppliers, which you couldn't do face to face. And it can also speed things up. It's not just a lack of, you know, reducing travel, but if you're doing a presentation and you don't want suppliers to know who they are, who the other suppliers are in the room, you would have to do that presentation 3 times, for example, if there's 3 suppliers. But with the technology, you can do that presentation once with them all watching the same presentation, not knowing who they are. So you can speed up the process and to actually make it much more effective. Richard, anything to add?
Okay.
No, I think that's excellent. Yeah.
Okay. Another question here from Radka. How do you structure the liability part of the contract if the scope isn't fully specified and you're relying on the provider as an expert stroke strategic partner?
Shall I take that one?
Yeah, certainly, Richard. Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So really, this comes down to the level of risk and the level of uncertainty. Now, generally speaking, the liability within the contract will be set within its limits, and of course have its various limitational factors around it. So that will be set in stone. The only real question will be whether there's an unfair contract terms implication, I believe. But really what we're looking for in that particular instance is how practically and pragmatically can we get over this, and how can we get to the right answer quickly so that we can cost this up in a way which is mutually agreeable to both parties. There are 2 ways really. First of all, if the gaps are there when you're going into the contract, we often suggests a post-contract verification period, maybe a 30-day period, depending on how many gaps there are. It may be more than that. With the terms of reference around that to make sure that the right things are being investigated, you're going to get the right outputs and the right answers. You can then validate that with a soft market testing, if you wish, by mutual agreement to make sure that the pricing is still competitive. And then further later on, if there are other areas which you know aren't going to be, say, in your first minimum viable product or whatever that might look like, but later on, you can set in place governance around that, whereby both parties agree what the process looks like in order to understand the scope, understand the success factors, and understand what the pricing and cost implications will be. And then the final point I'd suggest would be to think about incentivizing commercial structures whereby it's ensuring both parties are focused on getting to the fastest, best outcome together, and mutually incentivizing them in that direction.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Rich. I hope that was helpful, Radka. Another one from Rob. If the procurement policy changes over the coming weeks and months, but a procurement process is already underway, will any modification or change be needed, or is the previous policy still deemed valid? Steve?
So the wider procurement regulations, well, they are not going to change in the next couple of months. So I assume you're meaning the procurement policy notice that the government set out, so PPN 0120 that we discussed. So a couple of things I want to point out on that. Firstly, that does actually have a date stamp, an expiry date, sorry. I can't remember off the top of my head. If anybody wants that, then just type in the box and I'm happy to send you that afterwards. But PPN 0120, which says that you can do a direct award because of the COVID-19, really just backs up what's already in the regulations anyway, to be able to say why you could, what the circumstances are to do a direct award because of, COVID-19 being unforeseeable, for example. So as long as you're still hitting those rules, you can still do a direct award. But, when that policy notice was issued, of course it was unforeseeable. If you're only starting your procurement now, you should question whether you could have planned for this a little bit better and started this procurement a couple of months ago. If the answer is you still couldn't have done that, then of course it would still be a valid reason.
Okay, thank you, Steve. We've got another, well, there's quite a lot of questions actually. I'm just going through them here. There's one here from Louise, actually a similar question from a young lady called Claire. With Regulation 32, can you confirm that a VEET notice, for those who aren't familiar, VEET is a voluntary ex-ante transparency notice, is required initially, and then the contract award notice afterwards. Steve?
Yeah, well, the clue in the name there about being transparent, I would say the best route to be transparent is to issue that VEET notice. I believe you also then need to wait 10 days before, 10-day standard still period before actually signing the contract, and you would still issue the contract notice, contract award notice within 30 days after that. So that would be the best route. It does cover your back. However, although that is the best route, from what we're seeing in the marketplace at the moment is, a lot of people are not doing that, and nor are they even issuing the contract award notice. So I'm not saying that's it's allowed in any event, absolutely not. And I think there's going to be some scrutiny over the coming months for those people that have not really been following the rules properly.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think we've got time just for one last question. This is probably for you, I suspect, Rich. Using an existing framework, if the suppliers have been pre-vetted, which they are on the public sector frameworks, do you still need to somehow contract for the supplier's advice separately to the solution that's bought, or by the fact that they've been pre-vetted on the framework, is that not necessary?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'd say really it depends very much on the framework. There are some frameworks which will allow mini competitions, and that then gives you the capability to decide whether or not you wish to start implementing concepts such as contracting for advice. You can, I'd suggest always to reach into a framework and always have a look to the good industry practice clause and that definition, because it very often is quite widely drafted, and it does place levels of foresight, etc., on the levels of foresight on the provider, and so really, you know, the question I guess to ask is, how much additional value will you get for the contracting for advice piece, and really, what are you seeking to achieve from it? And if it's a case of we really need to do this, we want to pay for the professionals and specialists within the provider to come in and properly scope this out in order to give us X, Y, and Z information, and we know we need those people rather than a sales team giving us that, then at that point, contracting for advice is a very wise thing to do, because it helps the other organisation get you the best people for the job. So I'd certainly recommend thinking about that type of mechanism in that type of instance. If it's just a regular sales process, then yeah, always each framework, as Steve said, will have its own items. But really, when you think about the due diligence which takes place to get these people onto these frameworks, that's really around, you know, referential due diligence, around financial standing, maybe if they've done it before. The most important thing for you, for every buying organisation, isn't really what have they done elsewhere. It's what are they going to do for us, and that's the due diligence that you really that we would recommend you get a very robust strategy in place, just to ensure that every opportunity is given both for yourselves and for the providers to be able to do the necessary due diligence to get you the very best possible answers, and then for both parties to contract and reflect that in a way in which they're both mutually very confident.
That's superb. Thank you for that, Richard. Now, we've gone a little bit over time answering these questions, so I think we're going to have to draw that to a close now. But may I just thank everybody for attending the webinar. And if you'd like an informal chat to just follow up or clarify any of the points that we've raised, just type FP into the informal chat box, into the questions box, sorry, and then we can follow up. Thank you very much for attending, and all have a good day. Take care. Goodbye.